So I guess I'm here from the regulatory side to talk about how we in Tucson have been able to move it forward from standards, from voluntary work to requirements, mandatory stuff. So one of the things Maria Elena Gaynor had said in the beginning was that there is a paradigm shift. And I think one of those paradigm shifts is that before regulations used to come from the top down, but now as we see, it's starting to come from the bottom up because the community is asking for it. They're providing statistics for it. So now we're starting to validate that at the regulatory level. So what I'm going to try to do is talk a little bit about how we may look if we do nothing, because we know some of that coming out of climate change, but also to talk about what the challenges are today. I think the speakers before me have covered some of that. It's not only about stormwater that's happening in the communities, but it's also about water use and our resources and how they are becoming less abundant. And then lastly, how to move these voluntary actions into regulatory actions so that everybody becomes responsible to do this and not just on a voluntary level. So first off, let's talk a little bit about climate change. We know that climate change is coming. The International Panel on Climate Change has already indicated that. At the University of Arizona, we are fortunate enough to have Jonathan Oberpeck, who is the leader of that panel. And then just last year, they came out with an interim report and one specifically for the Southwest. So what you see here on the map is a heat map of the city of Tucson Basin. On the right-hand side, you see the temperature gauge, where yellow is the hottest and blue is the coolest. In the lower right-hand, you can see the city of Tucson. You can see the grid of streets is all very yellow. And then if it were zoomed in, you could see where the airport is, where the mall is, and where I-10 and I-19, the highways are, because those are all very yellow. You see in the surrounding areas, the Catalina Mountains is very cool, as well as the Santa Cruz River that Brad talked about. Even though it has no water, there's a water table there that keeps some vegetation, so it is still cool. So a little bit about the climate change aspects. For me, my background also is in medicine. I'm a nurse. So urban heat islands has been a very important part of urban development for me. So we know that heat in our cities are increasing because we have more impervious surfaces. And what the climate change researchers and scientists are saying is that heat and drought are the #1 natural causes of death in our community. And Arizona has the highest of all in the United States. So what they're also saying is, okay, we're getting hotter, our precipitation is getting less, but when we have storm events, they're getting more severe, but we can do something about it. And that something is, as we've mentioned before, is planting trees. A hydrologist and a scientist at the U of A says trees are the best movers of waters. As Brad indicated, the roots suck up the water and the leaves transpire and lets the water out. So they're one of the best movers of water. So when we talk about green infrastructure, we want to make sure we have these trees because they're going to help us cool the environment, but they're also going to help us move that water. Okay, so both the top speakers before me, Sam and Brad, talked about water resources. What this pie chart is showing in red is that as consumers of water, 26 to 45% of the water we use, we consume in our homes, is for the outdoors. So from the regulatory side, Tucson Water, City of Tucson has the water utility, and we're talking about 2 buckets of water. The first bucket is the groundwater, which we know we have already started depleting. We're already in fossil water. The second one is surface water. And even as Brad said, for us, it's the Colorado River. For you here in Juarez, you're pretty similar. You have two groundwater tables here. It's the, let's see, the Bolsón de Juego and the Bolsón de la Mesilla. Those are your groundwater aquifers. And your surface water comes from the Rio Grande. For us, the surface water comes from miles away, which is the Colorado River. So when we talk about green infrastructure, I point out we're tapping into 3 smaller buckets of water. We don't want to touch the groundwater, and we don't want to touch the surface water. So with the green streets infrastructure, we're starting to tap into the street water, the storm water. And then also in the city of Tucson, we passed a rainwater harvesting ordinance that all commercial developers who have started since 2010 have to comply with. The third bucket of water is still a voluntary side. It's an incentive to residential homes that if they start doing water harvesting, then they can get some money back for doing that. All right, so in terms of streets, what are we doing? Well, we know about stormwater management, and Doug talked about that, and the EPA, and how water is sort of necessary, or trying to control that stormwater, and how to do that not only for pollution and water quality, but also how to keep our environments healthy. So what we're trying to do is move from that first picture in the upper left hand, which was the channelized infrastructure, to what Doug even talked about. I think his example was the LA channelized river, moving from that channelization to more green. And in that way, again, if we think about the trees being movers of water, the roots suck up the water, and then it moves out through its leaves. But it also helps to make the environment healthier, and in particular, our urban environment. So when we start talking about regulations, I'll get into that part now that nobody really wants to think about, but from us on a public side, there are certain regulatory mandates that we have to look at. And so we've sort of moved from guidelines, that's policy level, to regulations, which is code, but then compliance, how to police all of that. And that can be a burden for the city if the inspectors aren't out there. So in the city of Tucson, a lot of our compliance side becomes what we call complaint driven. If somebody complains about it, the inspectors go out and look at it. If they don't complain about it, such as when Brad did his illegal curb cutting, if nobody complains about it, we're not going to go out there and look at it. All right, so let's see, we're starting to talk about, okay, in the beginning, Tucson was pretty far ahead. I think that the landscape architect in the transportation department was forward thinking. So even back in the late 1900s, 1998, he was already practicing some green infrastructure. Okay, so as Brad said, it was still illegal to cut the curbs. Now the curbs are public property, so he wasn't cutting curbs, but he was collecting rainwater on site already. And so that was sort of some of the movement. He was trying to get the engineers to do the curb cuts, but they weren't listening. You know, the engineers don't want to hear about it. They're thinking that it's going to undermine the pavement. It's going to do all the bad things, and they're going to have to do more repairs. So then Brad came along. He did his illegal cut. I came along. I joined the city. So now there were two landscape architects arguing for the curb cuts. But the engineers are still like, no, 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 we don't want to hear anything. So then it was like, okay, what would it take to make you guys approve curb cuts? And they said, tell us who else is doing it, you know? What other engineers are okaying this? So it's like, okay. So I sent them some contacts from Portland, and Portland rains more, and they were already doing it. And then after a week, they said, okay, we'll approve these curb cuts. So now on the city's web page, we have standards listed, and anybody can do it. If you want a permit, you can get a permit. You have to go through a process, but now it's legal. So that first lesson is engineers talk to engineers. So if you guys are engineers out there and you believe it, talk to your coworkers. If you are not engineers, find an engineer who believes in it and talk to them and convince them to do it. All right, so now the city, it's become legal even for the city. So the city transportation department did several projects on their own with these curb cuts. It wasn't mandated yet, but they were starting to do it. So we have several projects in the city that started to use these curb cuts, and they're working, as Brad even showed you. All right, so the second ordinance, the second piece, the ordinance that came into play was the rainwater harvesting ordinance. And we thought, oh, there's no way we're going to get a rainwater harvesting ordinance passed. But there was a champion on the city council, and he was listening to his constituents, and his constituents were saying, we think this is an important thing for the community, so you have to do a rainwater harvesting ordinance. The developers weren't on board yet, but the community was definitely on board. So how did we do it? Well, you have to consider all of the stakeholders. There were multiple stakeholders, the developers, the plumbers, realtors, the people who were selling property. They were all the people who we needed to consider. There were actually 3 things that this council member wanted to happen. One was that all new residential homes get plumbed for gray water use. As Brad was saying, things from your sink, from your shower, from your washer can feed water into your yard. So he wanted not that all residential had to use it, but that the plumbing had to be capable of switching the gray water on. The second one was that all residential homes had to be set up so that it could have solar hot water. It's not that the homes needed to have that solar power, but just that if the resident, the homeowner, wanted to hook up to solar power, they could plug in. And then the third one was that all commercial development had to be 100% rainwater harvesting. That is to say that 45% of outdoor use would go away, that all of that would be just from rainwater harvesting. He got the first 2 passed. The third one was modified. So how did we do that? One is mayor and council appointed a multi-diverse group of people to help craft the ordinance itself. So what we have in Tucson is a very strong community-powered people. So it was important for mayor and council that they had a diverse group to help craft this ordinance. So there were developers, realtors, people from the professional trade, and the nonprofits. The second thing that the staff thought was very important was there had to be some kind of development standards so that when a plan came in for review, that the person submitting the plan would understand what they needed to submit in order to get their plan for development approved. So the second committee that was formed, mostly put together by staff, was the technical side. How do we do this water harvesting? And this was composed of people from the architects, the landscape architects, the university researchers. I think Brad was on that committee. And then also various divisions of the city. So the planning and development side department, the Office of Conservation and Sustainable Development. We are now called the Office of Integrated Planning. Tucson Water was involved, as well as the Transportation Department and Parks and Rec. So what we were able to do is, one, all right, so the water harvesting ordinance got passed in 2008. But notice, instead of a 100% requirement, it moved down to 50%. So what this means is that the commercial development, it's required to have some vegetation around the perimeter and in the parking area. And 50% of that water need would be met by water harvesting. And only 50% would be met by potable water. And only when it was necessary. So we know in Tucson, probably like here in Juarez, between March and July are the hot seasons with no rain. So we know there's going to be a need for some supplemental water. So that's okay. But the developers felt requiring 100% was too much. We thought we could get to 80%, but that was also too much. So the compromise was 50%. The second part was the development standards got put in place. So now when the developer comes in with his plans, he knows what he needs to put on those plans. And one of the most important things he needs to put on there is a water budget table. If you go to the City of Tucson's website, there's a table on there, and all the developer has to do is populate some numbers, the calculation gets done for them, and then they submit their plans. At the bottom, the calculation shows whether or not they've met that 50%. If they did not meet that 50%, they have to go back to the drawing board and figure out their basin areas and their plants to make it sure that it gets met. So the lesson learned here, that community transparency in Tucson is very important. The citizens needed to know what was happening. So we put a process in place, and we stuck to that process. So even though we didn't agree to 100%, we stuck to the process and got to 50%, and it was agreed by everyone. And so when mayor and council voted on it, they felt comfortable. There was very little opposition to it, and it happened. So one is transparency on the process, and two is stick to your process. So let's talk a little bit now about the green infrastructure policy that we have in place. In the beginning, again, the City of Tucson has been quite ahead. Tucson Water has been very proactive in conservation. So they already had manuals in place for rainwater harvesting. The top manual, rainwater harvesting, that yellow and green one, was created by the Transportation Department because they were seeing an importance that needed to happen in the streets. And as Sam showed, the watershed management worked with transportation so that in residential streets with lower traffic volumes, what the engineers were starting to accept was, okay, in those neighborhoods, you can go ahead and have green infrastructure, and we'll help you put it together. We'll help you find some money to put it together. And if there's enough volunteers to also work on it, we'll help implement that. And again, watershed management also worked with the city, and they wanted to move one step forward or farther to make it even better. So instead of just communities and neighborhoods asking voluntarily for this kind of green infrastructure, they were pushing for it to become mandatory that all streets that the city started to look at would incorporate some kind of green infrastructure. So this is not an ordinance. It's what we call a policy in the Department of Transportation, an active practice guidelines. And so what they started to do was work with the city, work with a group of people, and last year the Transportation Department accepted this as a policy, and all consultants who work on any city roadway projects are given these active practice guidelines. There's more than green streets, but they're giving all of it. So I think one of the true tests that happened was there was a street design under construction. It was a redesign of a street, and 60% of that design was already completed. And this policy got accepted by transportation. those engineers went back to the drawing board and they put in green infrastructure, and now they're 100% complete, and there is green infrastructure in that design. So the little drawing at the bottom is one of their drawings on how they incorporated that green infrastructure into their construction drawings. So it's not an easy task. So the lessons learned here is there is a paradigm shift. There is a ground swelling from the bottom up. There is a way that EPA is now starting to look at how we manage stormwater, and there is a way that the city is also saying, hey, you know, we have this urban heat island, we have to mitigate it, we wanted to make it more livable for people, and the best way to do that is trees and shade, getting people out there, as Brad said, get to know your neighbors, get to know your businesses. It's good for economics, but it takes a whole community to push it forward. So not only watershed management, we have another nonprofit called Trees for Tucson, Tucson Clean and Beautiful. They also pushed for it. There were consultants like Wheat Scharf is landscape architecture, Stantec is a engineering company, and also our regional government, the Pima Association of Government, as well as the Pima County Flood Control. We're starting to work with all of them. We're all starting to get on the same page or trying. So the 3 buckets of water at least the city of Tucson has. We are covering streets now, we're covering commercial development, and we cover residential. So we're trying to hit those smaller buckets of water so we don't have to dip into the bigger buckets of water, and we can reserve those for other needs. All right, so just a little, I think Doug covered also how EPA is moving forward. We've been recognized by EPA, Pima County, for our green infrastructure programs. So I think that's the end. Here's some resources here. But I also want to mention another piece that will be spoken tomorrow is about the cost-benefit analysis. So both Brad and Sam talked a little bit about the quantitative analysis they've been doing in terms of how much water they've been able to capture and save. I think the next piece for us is that cost-benefit analysis. The city of Tucson just finished a report. It's online also under Pima County's Regional Flood Control District, and it was a cost-benefit analysis, and it really excited me from the public sector, because when it looks at the pie chart of who benefits from green infrastructure, over 50% of the beneficial party, stakeholders, is the government and the community. And the smallest piece is really the user. So in terms of streets, that means the driver of the vehicle is a small beneficiary, but the rest of the community is a big beneficiary of the green infrastructure. That's it. Thank you.